I suppose if I'm introducing myself, I'm a recovering bureaucrat. I worked for 12 years in the British government, mainly doing international development work. I left about 10 years ago, largely because I realized I'd hit a level of seniority where I was being tested on my weakest competence, which was obedience. And I realized that if I stayed in government for much longer, I would make myself and everyone else miserable. So I went off and wrote some books, and including writing about the financial crisis. And from that work emerged our work on the Social Progress Index that I'll talk a bit about now. But I want to start by saying I really believe that we are at this absolutely critical moment in history. We're at this crossroads where we're seeing the death of one paradigm and the birth of a new paradigm. And the question is, what is the new paradigm going to be? The old paradigm that's dying is the one around economic growth. It's dominated since the Second World War. It accelerated with the fall of the Berlin Wall. And one thing I want to say at the beginning is it did a lot of good for the world. People's quality of life in many, many countries improved. And we also saw the absolutely spectacular reduction in extreme poverty that we've seen, particularly in China and India, from 1990 through to 2015, driven by economic growth. So economic growth has done a huge amount to improve the quality of life of people around the world, but it's got huge problems. The first of which is obviously environmental, that we are not able to keep this economic engine going, working in the way it is within the limits of our planet, and we have this ever-accelerating environmental crisis. But what we also have is the fact the model itself was breaking down. The financial crisis of 2008 was such a shock for so many people in the economics profession. They thought, we've got it all cracked. Economists called the period 20 years before the financial crisis of 2008 the Great Moderation. The Great Moderation was this period when we had solid economic growth, low unemployment, low inflation. They thought they'd cracked it. And then suddenly we hit this wall, the financial crisis happens, and we realize that so much of what we thought was progress was actually a mirage. And this was an absolute shock to people. This thing was not working how we thought it was working. It's also been a crisis for politicians. Remember Bill Clinton's thing, it's the economy, stupid. Yeah? Keep the economy growing, keep unemployment low, and you're guaranteed to be re-elected. That was the rules of politics. And then we've seen that started to break down as well. And what we've also seen in the last 10 years is that rising trend of anger and discontent linked to rising inequality, lack of progress in people's lives. And this is why I feel that we're seeing the end of this paradigm of economic growth as being the metric of success of our societies, and the birth of a new one. And what worries me greatly is the new paradigm that we're seeing emerge is this nativist populism about my country first, this rejection of others. And so we're at this really dangerous point that unless we can create a different vision for the future of our societies that binds us together, we're going to be heading into a very, very negative place. And that's why I think the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 Agenda, are so important. Because they do represent this consensus about a plan for the kind of societies we're trying to build. But we've got to build consensus, bind people together around delivering this shared vision. The SDGs are not a technocratic exercise to be left to the UN or to be left to experts. It's got to be something that is a motivating, binding factor for humanity, one that works for us in our politics and our societies to unite us around a set of common goals. So the SDGs, I believe, are critically important for the world at this time. And as we all know, we've got these 17 goals. Now, the slight problem we have in all this is the goals are, to be quite frank, a bit of a mess. Yeah? I mean, if you're trying to get people to remember things, you don't have 17 goals. Yeah? I mean, Richard Curtis and his friends have done a great job in coming up with clever little logos for each of them. But if you're trying to inspire people, you don't start with the number 17. Yeah? And then even more problematic is we find that the goals themselves, there's overlaps, there's sort of contradictions. Then even the way that we measure the goals, we've got a whole set of problem with the indicators. The indicators for the goals, even where the indicators are stated, often the data is missing. The latest report of the expert working group on SDG indicators said that there's a third of indicators that we can measure now. There's a third of indicators we can only measure for some countries, which means they're not going to be measurable for most countries. And there's a third of indicators that no one's able to measure. And please forgive my slightly dodgy maths, but there's another third, which is stuff that's in there as concepts for which there are no indicators because it's too controversial. So things around rights and inclusion in particular, they are there in the SDGs in the overall language, but they're nowhere there in the indicators because that would offend certain countries that have no interest in this. So the SDGs, I think we have to see as being this promise, this consensus, this vision that we can align around, but there's a huge challenge to operationalize it. And we can't rely on this being some top-down plan from the UN that's then going to be implemented through national governments and cascade through. That will fail. And I think we're seeing this 3 years in, the way that there's this growing sense of, actually it's not moving fast enough. We've got to get organized fast enough. And that's why there's got to be a response from the grassroots, from different sectors coming together, from innovators and entrepreneurs like you. So that's why I'm delighted to be here today. This is the challenge. This is what the energy we need to unite around this vision. Because if we can't unite around this vision, I worry the direction our world is moving in. So that's sort of an overhead of my perspective on the SDGs. We at the Social Progress Imperative are trying to do our part by trying to put in place a measurement framework that can actually support SDG implementation. And I'm not clicking fast enough. I'm losing my slides. So very quickly, the Social Progress Index does not look like the SDGs. And maybe it'll come paint to life. Here we go. There we go. So this is the Social Progress Index framework, which some of you will have seen in your pre-reading. But let me just quickly go through it. We've built the Social Progress Index to look at 3 fundamental aspects of what makes a good society. First of all, does everyone have the basic needs of survival? Fundamentally, food and basic health, water and sanitation, shelter and safety. Those basic things you need to survive. Secondly, do people have the building blocks of a better life, the foundations of well-being? Education, access to information, health, and a good quality environment. And finally, do people have opportunity? Can people pursue their hopes and dreams with rights, freedoms, inclusion, and access to advanced knowledge? These are sort of these 12 components, these basic building blocks of what makes a good society. Now, we are never all going to agree on what makes a good society. We've been talking about this certainly since Aristotle. I do not claim to have cracked what Aristotle didn't. But what we have is there's a lot of literature around this from the works of Amartya Sen and other economists. There's a lot of consensus around this that's reflected in the SDGs. But I think these concepts, which align with the SDGs, are very sort of, are common to a whole range of societies and work as a good functional definition of what makes a good society. And then critically, they align with those SDGs. And so all we've done simply here is map how the SDGs fit broadly with those different concepts. So we say the Social Progress Index is a way of measuring the concepts of the SDGs. And critically, we can measure those concepts because we have the data. The UN is so constrained about the data it can use to have official indicators. They're very limited in the data they can use. Because we're a non-governmental, non-profit organization, we can be a bit more promiscuous with the data we're using and use different sources. Some of it comes from the UN and the World Bank, but some of it can also come from expert assessments or polling organizations or different sources. So we can find different ways of measuring these concepts using data that's not necessarily usable by the official measurement system. Critically, we've built this index as one that can be aggregated so we can look at the whole package. Because this is, I think, one of the challenges with the SDGs is we'll end up with this conversation, well, are we doing okay on SDG 7, but how are we doing on SDG 11, and what's the overall story? So what we can do with Social Progress Index is aggregate all together how we're doing on all the SDGs into a single number against which we can track progress. This just seems very important. If you watch the news, on any subject about the economy or anything else, if there's an indicator, it's about a single number that goes up and down. Yeah? The stock exchange, the FTSE exchange went up 10 points today. Unemployment went down 0.4% today. You need single numbers. If you just have a dashboard saying, well, this bit went up a bit, this went down a bit, and there's a bit of this, a bit of that, you lose people. So to engage people around, are we making progress against the SDGs? You've got to be able to bring it together into a single number and say, is it on track? Is it off track? Where are we getting? And we need that if we're going to monitor our own programs, but also hold others to account. So that's what we try to do with Social Progress Index, measure progress against the SDGs and be able to aggregate it together into a measure of progress. Okay? So what we've done with Social Progress Index is we've added it all together into a score of between 0 and 100, and we've calibrated that against the SDGs, where 0 is like the worst possible score, and 100 is achieving the SDGs. And I've lost my screen, am I back? Am I not clicking enough? Am I not waving my hands enough or something? So with the Social Progress Index, we measure about 95% of the world's population. And what we've got to be able to measure here is our progress against the SDGs. So when we started the SDGs, the world was scoring about 69 out of 100. And so the challenge for the SDGs over the next 15 years was to move the world up from 69 to 100. That's what achieving the SDGs means, measured against the Social Progress Index. Okay? That's the challenge. And what we found was that obviously there's a big range of possibilities of scores at the moment. So Denmark is very close to achieving the SDGs, Central African Republic has got a long, long way to go, and everyone else is in the middle. Yeah? So that's where we are today. And if we break down the countries a bit more, starting with the richest countries of the world, we see how countries like Denmark are all pretty close. All the rich countries are quite close, haven't yet hit those SDGs. And if we project it forward on whether those rich countries are going to achieve the SDGs, what we see is they're not all going to get there. So Denmark looks like it's going to get to the SDGs. Germany and Japan are going to get close. But the rest of the G7 are actually going to fall short of hitting those SDG targets. And I think this is really important, is that the UN system traditionally has set itself up around development targets focused on developing countries. The SDGs were explicitly set up as being a plan for the whole world. And basically, the rich countries of the world are not paying attention. They're not taking it for themselves. Very few of these rich countries have any meaningful plan to achieve the SDGs. And as a result, they're going to miss the targets. And I think that's one of the first things we've got to do is make sure we're sure it applies to every country. I never hear a British politician talk about the SDGs. Why do the SDGs not apply here? They should. They should be applying everywhere. So that's the first thing I wanted to emphasize. If we then look at the big countries of the world that are the ones that are going to make or break the SDGs, here they are in 2018. If we project their progress forward, we're going to see that most of them are not good, none of them are actually going to hit the SDG targets. So currently, if we add all this together up for the world, what we see is if the world is scoring 69 in 2015, by 2018, we've only got to 70.5, and by 2030, we're only going to get to 75.15. Not quite sure I have my slides. Let's push this up. Can we do that? So we have a real problem with these SDGs. The SDGs are fundamentally off track. So if the SDGs are the fundamental new paradigm that we need if we're going to build a sustainable, inclusive, fair world, we should be very, very worried. The plan is not going to work on our current trajectory. We're going to fall a long way short. So that's something that really should be concerning to us. Then we've got to figure out what's going on. Why are we going to fall short? And so what I want to do is break it down now by 3 issue areas. The first of which is around these sort of basic SDG issues. There we go. So this is where it's starting with the very basic SDGs around hunger and health. Now let me be clear, what I'm talking about here in health is the very basic things, so maternal and child mortality, infectious diseases. There's other places where we measure some of the more advanced, sophisticated, non-communicable diseases, mental health, etc. But on basic health, what we see is that the richest countries of the world have all hit the basic SDG target. And then we see some emerging markets like Brazil and Russia and Mexico are pretty close. But then other countries, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Nigeria, India, have quite some way to go. And if we project this forward to 2030 based on current trends, what we see is actually a lot of progress. And I think this is also a very important thing when we're talking about the SDGs, is to not give in to pessimism. It is astonishing how many people think the world is inevitably going backwards. Yeah? The world has made this huge amount of progress. If you haven't seen the work of Hans Rosling, the Swedish statistician who sadly died last year, his TED Talks, his book Factfulness are terrific on this, about how we misperceive the world, how people think the world is getting worse when actually we're making huge strides of progress, and progress is possible. And this is why this is important when we look at those basic SDGs around basic health and hunger, is actually the world is making a lot of progress against these. It's uneven. I mean, Ethiopia is making huge strides in recent years. Yeah? And if that could be continued, Ethiopia could get very close to the SDGs. Bangladesh has made huge strides, and again, could get very close. Now, other countries are not doing so well, and there are countries that have got challenges, like the Philippines is not improving fast enough, Pakistan's not improving fast enough. But there's real potential if we could move as quickly as some of those leading countries, actually get very close to achieving those SDGs. So on current trends, the world is forecast to hit 94.5 by 2030. If we could get some of those laggard countries to be moving as quickly as Ethiopia and Bangladesh, if we can sustain the progress in those countries like Bangladesh and Ethiopia, we could get very, very close to achieving those SDGs. Achieving those SDGs means ending unnecessary deaths from things like diarrhea, ensuring that no child goes to bed hungry. That would be a massive achievement. So SDGs 2 and 3 within our grasp, if we can organise, if we can keep pushing on. Now, another area where it's not so good is around SDG 6 on water and sanitation. So here again we see Russia, Mexico, Brazil quite close to the SDG target, but those that are lagging behind, Ethiopia, Nigeria, India, a long way to go to hit the water and sanitation goals. If we project forward progress, we see, again, there's some progress, but it's not enough, not fast enough. And if we do for the world as a whole, we're projecting about 85.6 by 2030. Water and sanitation is a solved problem. We know how to deliver water and sanitation. We just have failed to scale it. And the fact that countries like the Philippines, I think Indonesia are not moving fast enough, the fact that Nigeria is going to show so little progress, this is a huge opportunity. If we could scale solutions on water and sanitation to these countries and accelerate progress, we could get much, much closer to these goals. The problem is it's been a bit of an orphan issue. The big problem is especially around sanitation. Sanitation just has not attracted the funding, the interest, the excitement to actually deliver the resources to achieve these goals. But we could get much, much closer to these goals if we had the effort and the will to mobilize the resources to achieve this, particularly in certain critical countries. So SDG 6 is, in a sense, the biggest opportunity of the SDGs. It's a solved problem that we just need to scale to achieve. And then finally, I want to talk about where we're really struggling, which is around issues of rights and inclusion. So this kind of covers things like some aspects of SDG 1 on poverty, SDG 5 on gender equity, SDG 10 on inequality, SDG 11 on inclusive cities, and SDG 16 on rights and justice. It's sort of a bundle of different concepts under the SDGs that we measure as rights and inclusiveness. And on these two issues, we see the world scores are pretty low at the moment when we started. The world score in 2018 is 64.9, and inclusiveness 45.8. So these are areas that the world is finding quite hard. Why? Well, part on rights, because some countries have chosen explicitly to advance economically without granting human rights, particularly China. And then on inclusiveness, it's because it's a problem we see every country is struggling with. So this is why we see quite low scores here. But these are fundamental parts of the SDG agenda. And what we see on these issues is that what's most worrying is the direction of travel. So here are the personal rights scores, a little bit hard to read. So the blue blob is 2018, the circle is 2015. And what we've seen over the last 3 years for the most populous countries is the overall trend is backwards. So the world is actually moving backwards on personal rights issues, which are a key part of the SDG agenda. We see the same thing on inclusiveness. we see the world actually is moving backwards on a bunch of these measures, for countries ranging from the United States and Brazil going backwards, but also places like Ethiopia. So we're seeing this negative trend on inclusiveness, that if we project forward, we actually will see the world going backwards on these scores rather than going forwards. So if we're thinking about that SDG agenda as a whole, we've got to recognize there are different challenges. In some cases, it's about how do we maintain momentum and finish the job on things like hunger and basic health. Yeah, there's real momentum. We just have to finish that job and really execute. There are other things where there's a solution waiting for us if only we could grasp it on water and sanitation. And then there are other issues where we are struggling to find solutions, where we need to have a new competition of ideas to find solutions on how to build rights in inclusive societies. So the SDGs contains a whole bundle of these different challenges that we have to work that are different in every single country. They're also different in every different region, every city, state, community. So the other part of the challenge is how do we localize this SDG agenda? I can show you data for the United States or for China or for the UK. These are big places with varied challenges. So one of the other things we're doing with the Social Progress Index is helping to build those for different communities. So we're building them for different, so in India we built it for different states, districts and cities. In the United States we've been building it for states, cities, even down for neighborhoods. And that way you can make the challenge real and make it concrete in every community to allow the innovation to occur. Because these SDGs will not be delivered by the UN. They will not be delivered by governments on their own. They won't be delivered by businesses on their own. It's got to be about a new way of running our societies, a new collaboration across sectors, and a new way of working together that's not business as usual. Because if it's business as usual, we're going to fail. And if we fail, I worry greatly about where our world is heading. There is no more important challenge now than delivering on the 2030 agenda for the world and for our communities. So I thank you, I applaud you, and I look forward to talking about your work and sharing this together. Thank you very much.